Here we will examine the structures of bones, the bone cells, and the effects of exercise and nutrients on building bone tissue and bone mass. We'll begin with the structures of bones by looking at the structures of long bones, because long bones are going to be our example or our model bone that we're going to use in order to compare to other bones. The long bones, because they're longer than they are wide, they typically form the bones that give length to the limbs. So that is the upper limbs and the lower limbs. And so they usually have two expanded ends, and those expanded ends are referred to as the epiphyses. The epiphyses are the structures that form joints with other bones of the skeleton. The epiphyses are connected in the middle by a bony cylinder that's referred to as the diaphysis. The middle of the epiphyses, that is internally to the epiphyses, those contain a porous bone that is referred to as spongy bone, because the spongy bone helps to keep the epiphyses supported, but it also helps to reduce their weight, because bones don't need to be solid in order to support our body weight. And the fact that they are not solid, the fact that they are made of porous bone tissue, means that there are other tissues that can occupy the space between that spongy bone. Specifically in the epiphyses, we see that there is a type of marrow called red bone marrow that fills the spaces between spongy bone. And it's red bone marrow that creates the blood cells. So the tissue that's in red marrow is the tissue that leads to the creation or forms all of the blood cells that we see. That is the red blood cells, which we call the erythrocytes, the white blood cells that function in defense, which we call the leukocytes, and cell fragments that we refer to as platelets that help to form parts of clots, or at least begin the clotting process. We also see that the middle of the diaphysis also contains an empty space, or a hollow space, and that cavity is referred to as the medullary cavity. Now, that medullary cavity is normally not completely empty in living tissue. It typically contains a type of marrow called yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is primarily composed of adipose tissue. It's very well vascularized. And of course, as we know from the tissues module, the adipose tissue functions in the storage of lipids, so that those lipids can be metabolized for energy. So let's take a look at the epiphyses, the diaphysis, the red marrow, and the yellow marrow in a diagram here. So in this diagram, we see at the top side, we see the epiphysis, which forms the proximal end of that limb or that structure, which is usually referred to as the proximal epiphysis. This happens to be a femur bone here. So it turns out that this proximal epiphysis of the femur here is the part of the femur that forms the hip joint. We see the distal end of the femur as the distal epiphysis, which forms the knee joint, and then we also see the diaphysis in the middle connecting them. You can see a cutaway of the proximal epiphysis here that shows the red bone marrow, along with the spongy bone that exists as the gray material between that red bone marrow. And we also see a little bit of the yellow marrow that occupies the diaphysis inside of the medullary cavity. We see that between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, that is internally in the long bone, we see a line or ridge of bony tissue that's referred to as the epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line is actually the remnant of a hyaline cartilage growth plate that is referred to as the epiphyseal plate. So in adults, that is ages 25 and older, the epiphyseal line is simply a line of bony tissue. But in adolescents and children, the epiphyseal plate is made out of hyaline cartilage, and it is the hyaline cartilage in that epiphyseal plate that grows and causes the bone to grow longer in length, because some of that hyaline cartilage is eventually replaced by bone. The cartilage continues growing in length to lengthen the bone, and then bone tissue eventually replaces that hyaline cartilage. So that is how our bones grow in length during childhood and adolescence. Superficially or externally, the long bone is covered by a connective tissue sheet called the periosteum. The periosteum is made out of dense, irregular connective tissue. The periosteum helps to bind and connect blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves to the surface of the bone. But the periosteum also serves as a point of attachment for tendons and ligaments to anchor to the external surface of the bone. The external ends of the epiphyses are not covered with periosteum, but they are covered with thin hyaline cartilage sheets that are referred to as the articular cartilage, because the articular cartilage forms padding between joints. So this articular cartilage helps to reduce friction in addition to absorbing impact forces and shock at the joint. Likewise, the inner surfaces of both compact and spongy bone are also covered by a thin connective tissue sheet, or a thin membrane, as it were, that's referred to as the endosteum. And we'll see later on that this endosteum is primarily composed of cells that help to grow and repair the bone tissue. So looking once again at the diagram, we see that the articular cartilage covers the two epiphyses at the ends of the long bone. We also see a little bit of the periosteum that's kind of peeled away here on the diaphysis. It's showing the periosteum as attaching this artery to the surface of the bone. We get a little bit of a view of the endosteum, not a great view in this particular diagram. But we'll see some of the bone cells that make up the endosteum in just a few moments. So in looking at the structure of other bones, that is flat and irregular bones, we see that their layout is a little bit different, but does follow some of the same patterns that we saw with the long bones. So we see that flat and irregular bones are also constructed from compact bone, typically on their inner or outer surfaces. So that is, they have very dense bony tissue on primarily their outer surfaces. The outer surface is also covered by periosteum. The inner surface is likewise covered by endosteum, just like we see with the long bones. But typically the material between the compact bone of flat and irregular bones is spongy bone. So that is, we have this porous bone tissue that occupies the very center of flat and irregular bones. Typically we don't see a medullary cavity, so there's usually no yellow marrow in between flat and irregular bones, but we do see red marrow that occupies the space between the spongy bone material in flat and irregular bones. And of course that red marrow also contributes to forming blood cells, just like it does in the long bones as well. The external surface of bones is not smooth, but usually it's covered with rough patches, projections. It might even contain holes in it to allow for blood vessels and nerves to pass through the bone. So we're going to examine a few of those structures, those features, and give their descriptions here. We'll start with the head of a bone, and the head of a bone is usually described as a spherical or rounded articulating surface. So the head, particularly of long bones, is typically where joints are formed. So for example, the shoulder joint and the hip joint are formed by the heads of the humerus and the heads of the femur, respectively, to form the shoulder and the hip joints. Likewise, we see facets, which are usually articulating surfaces that form joints with other bones, but facets are flattened rather than spherical like the heads are. Condyles are more rounded articulating surfaces, so they are structures on bones that tend to form joints with other bones, and they tend to be somewhere between a facet and a head. That is, it's a little bit more rounded than a facet, but not quite the spherical shape that we see with the heads of bones. We also have a term called a process, or a structure called a process on bones. And a process is just a general term for a bony projection. So that is, if a piece of bone juts out from a bone, that's usually called a process. And that is a typical site of attachment for muscles or ligaments. We also have spines as well. That is, these are processes that are usually a lot more sharp and slender. And they also serve as attachment points for muscles and ligaments. We have tuberosities as well, which are usually roughened projections that provide kind of broad areas for tendons and ligaments and muscles to attach to. We have crests, which are simply thin bony ridges. So for example, on the hip bones, when you feel or palpate your hips through the skin near your abdomen, what you're actually feeling is the crest of the hip bone, or part of the hip bone there. So the term crest just defines or describes a bony ridge. We also have fossas that describe shallow basins in bones. Usually fossas are places where structures, like soft structures, will be supported by the bone. We have a sulcus, which is a shallow groove. Sulcus or sulci are usually places where blood vessels or nerves will pass through. We also have foramens, which are rounded or oval openings directly through bone tissue, so from one side of a bone to another, and usually a foramen allows the passage of a blood vessel or a nerve. Similarly, we have a meatus, which is a canal-like passageway, so that is more like a tunnel through the bone. And mostly these serve as passageways for sensory structures to go through. So for example, in the skull, we see a meatus in some of the skull bones that allows for sound to get from the external world into the to the middle ear, where it can vibrate the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. Last but not least, we see cavities within bones, or air-filled spaces or cavities, that are referred to as sinuses. And sinuses in bones usually help reduce the weight of bones. Usually they're filled with a very delicate spongy bone, but occasionally sinuses also contain sensory structures as well. So for example, there are sinuses in the cranial and facial bones of the skull that permit places for sensory structures to exist. We'll examine here the cells of bone tissue. Got 4 cells that we're examining and very briefly describe their functions. We will begin with osteoprogenitor cells. Osteoprogenitor cells are the stem cells of bone, so that is, these are relatively unspecialized cells of bone tissue whose function it is to undergo mitosis. So they create more of themselves, and then some of those osteoprogenitor cells will become a cell type called an osteoblast. And usually the osteoprogenitor cells are found in the very deepest layers of the periosteum. That is, they sit right against the external surface of bone tissue externally. But then the osteoprogenitor cells also make up the endosteum. That is, the bulk of that very delicate membrane that we described as the endosteum is typically made up of osteoprogenitor cells. So some of those osteoprogenitor cells will become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells that will build new collagen fibers in bone tissue. That is, collagen is a very important protein for bone tissue because it gives bone flexibility. And so osteoblasts are the cells that actually create collagen in new bone tissue. And rather than directly laying down calcium minerals, they use enzymes to promote calcium crystallization in the collagen fibers that they lay down. So the calcium comes from the bloodstream, and the osteoblasts are simply stimulating that calcium to crystallize and form the bone minerals. And typically the osteoblasts are found near or within the periosteum and endosteum, because they have to be close to the bone tissue in order to build it, so it makes sense that they're in close proximity to it. So after osteoblasts have had time to lay down collagen fibers and promote calcium crystal formation, they tend to become trapped in the bone minerals that they stimulate to form. And when they become trapped in the bone material, they become osteocytes. And osteocytes are mature bone cells that really just help to maintain the collagen and calcium minerals that are found within bone. So they don't really do anything to build new bone tissue, they simply maintain the bone tissue that is there. Typically, these are the cells that are found within those little lacuna that are the little cavities, little pits in compact bone. And last but not least, our final cell type is called the osteoclast. And an osteoclast is a special cell type that uses enzymes to break down the collagen fibers in bone, and it uses acids to break down calcium minerals. So when calcium needs to be added to the bloodstream, the osteoclasts use acids to dissolve those calcium minerals and place them into the bloodstream. Typically, the osteoclasts are found in the opposite surface of bone as osteoblasts. So if osteoblasts are found near the periosteum or the endosteum, typically osteoclasts are found somewhere in the middle, where they can start to kind of break down old bone tissue or break down bone tissue for the purpose of releasing those calcium minerals into the bloodstream. In our next and last topic here for the skeleton, we'll examine how exercise, nutrition, affects skeletal mass, as well as the building of bone tissue and things like that. So So bones, it turns out, require mechanical stresses in order to maintain the mass of those bones at normal levels. So when we say mechanical stresses, we mean things like body weight. So simply moving around and subjecting your skeleton to the forces of body weight, to the forces of gravity, are enough to help the skeleton, enough to stimulate the skeleton to maintain bone mass at normal levels. But also things like muscle pull, the strength of muscles, things like that, will also help to maintain bone mass as well. So this just goes to show that normal exercise and normal strength training to maintain not only muscle mass, but to maintain bone mass as well. And that's very, very important, especially as we get older. Because what we see is that bones will tend to lose mass. That is, the osteoclasts will start to dissolve the calcium minerals that are found in bone and break down the collagen fibers when individuals are sedentary, that is, when they are just not very active, or if an individual is bedridden. So bones will tend to lose bone mass when people are bedridden. And we also tend to see that bone mass decreases with age, even with exercise and a diet that's rich in calcium as well. So bones and the skeleton just aren't as efficient at maintaining themselves as we get older, and so we see this gradual decline in bone mass, which I'll show in another diagram here in just a moment. We see that bones will gain mass, that is, they'll gain collagen fibers as well as additional calcium minerals with exercise, with weight-bearing activity, and with muscle strength. So anything that helps to subject the skeleton to those mechanical stresses, increased muscle strength, increased weight-bearing activity, things like that will help to maintain normal bone mass. And normal exercise, normal strength training will help to slow down bone loss due to age. It does not completely reverse bone loss due to age, but it at least does help to slow down the effects of aging on the skeleton. So in this diagram here, this is figure 6.23 from the OpenStax textbook. What we see on the graph here is that we have bone mass, which is the amount of calcium in the skeleton in grams, and our age in years plotted on the horizontal axis, with bone mass plotted on the vertical axis here. So we see that from ages 0 to about 25 years of age for males, that bone growth and bone mass will continue to increase until males reach a peak bone mass of at about 25 years of age. For females, peak bone mass occurs at around 30 years of age or so. And what we notice are a couple of things here, right? So that we reach peak bone mass in our mid-20s or early 30s, and that females generally tend to have less bone mass overall compared to men. There's a few reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that testosterone that's produced by the male endocrine system helps to increase bone mass and helps to build bone mass at a faster rate than females do. We see that with both males and females, that bone mass decreases with age. That's a normal effect of aging, so it's losing bone mass. But as I mentioned previously, regular exercise, even light strength training can help to slow down that loss of bone mass with age. We also see that for females around 50 to 55 years of age, there's a very sharp decrease in bone mass due to menopause. And during menopause, the ovaries are not as active in producing hormones like estrogens. And it turns out that estrogens help to slow down the effects of osteoclasts. And so when those estrogen levels drop during menopause, the osteoclast activity accelerates because estrogens really help to slow down their initial activity. But as soon as that estrogen drops during menopause, then bone mass starts to decrease quite significantly because the osteoclasts are no longer being inhibited by those estrogens. So a few things that we'll take a look at before we wrap up this module are bone diseases, particularly osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition where the reabsorption or the breakdown of bone tissue by those osteoclasts occurs at a faster rate than the growth of bone by the osteoblasts and the osteocytes. Typically, osteoporosis, or loss of bone tissue, is very typical with age in both men and women, but it's especially critical in women because, as I mentioned earlier, the decline in estrogens with menopause helps to slow down the activity of the osteoblasts, which build bone tissue, but it also speeds up the activity of osteoclasts as well. So it speeds up and accelerates the breakdown of bone tissue in addition to slowing down the building of bone tissue. As I mentioned in the previous diagram, we also see that women tend to have less bone mass than men to begin with. Two important items that help our bodies to build bone, of course, are the calcium minerals that form the calcium extracellular matrix of bone tissue, but also vitamin D is an important nutrient as well. So both of these, both calcium and vitamin D, are extremely important for building bone tissue. Calcium obviously is the basis for the calcium minerals of our bone. All of the calcium that we have in our skeleton is obtained from our diet, and it primarily comes from dairy products, which are very rich in calcium. But in plant-based diets, or for plant-based diets, we see that green leafy vegetables and broccoli are also good sources of calcium, particularly if an individual is lactose intolerant or if an individual is just not consuming dairy products. Vitamin D is a very important vitamin because it aids in the absorption of calcium through the small intestine. So without vitamin D being present, the dietary calcium that we're consuming from our foods does not have an easy time to get across the walls of the small intestine and into the bloodstream where it needs to go. So even if we're consuming enough calcium, if we're not getting enough vitamin D, then we're not able to absorb that calcium as efficiently, and it's just going to pass through the small intestine without being absorbed. So typically that's why we see dairy products like milk being fortified with vitamin D, just to make sure that there's enough vitamin D present with the calcium that's also in milk in order to help make absorption of that calcium a lot more efficient.